like once you're 40, you're really hurtling towards cardiovascular disease. And most people, and once every 4 years is barely anything, right? This is something that should be done every year, maybe every 6 months, right? And probably starting at the age of 25, I would say that's where your sort of systems start declining. So it's too little too late in some ways. So getting that shift almost will take, like, first agreeing that you have to move beyond clinical biomarkers, and then second, you have to sort of get it done at a younger age and get that approved by Medicare or Medicaid would take forever, in my opinion, right? And that's, for example, at least in the US healthcare system. And doing it across the globe would take even longer.
Aging isn't a single clock winding down, but a hidden symphony of rhythms, some rushing ahead, others lagging behind, all shaping the music of our lives. Dr. Raghav Sehgal invites us to look beyond birthdays and blunt measures into a deeper pattern. 11 systems, each carrying its own tempo of resilience and decline, from fasting to neuroscience, from personal practice to public health. He uncovers a recurring truth. Complexity is not chaos, but harmony waiting to be tuned. In this conversation, you'll hear how science, story, and imagination intertwine to reveal a future where health is not just years added, but vitality composed. All right, Dr. Raghav Sehgal, a computational biologist and longevity researcher from Yale, whose systems-based epigenetics clock, Symphony Age, decodes aging across 11 bodily systems using DNA methylation insights. His TransAge framework rigorously evaluated 51 human interventions across multiple epigenetic clocks to identify biomarkers that are prognostic, responsive, and reliable, paving the way for accelerating clinical testing of aging therapies. A Forbes 30 under 30 honoree, a TEDx Yale speaker, and a biotech consultant. Dr. Sehgal uniquely bridges AI-driven innovation, translational science, and, well, the health narrative. His work makes him, well, an ideal guest for the DNA of Things, as we were just talking about. And we're really excited here today to explore how biology, technology, and, you know, the story of the human condition can become more deeper for our human flourishing through your lens. So, Raghav, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Thank you, Jeremy. And that introduction was a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, well, like I said, I always give credit where credit's due. Our friend, Chat 5 helps us with this kind of digital interrogation. But, interestingly, there is an opportunity for a human element of appreciation in that medium, and, carefully correcting for the hallucinations. I at least get to know the digital version of you, and I'm really excited to get to know the human version of you today. So you've done some, pretty amazing work, as the intro has preceded you. And so I'm really interested to know, how does one get into this realm of, predicting biological age, and what kind of captured you into taking this as a focal point in your life?
Yeah. So I guess this requires a bit of background. So I'm not a biologist by training, even a computational biologist by training, I'll be honest. I did my undergrad in electronics engineering, which is completely different. But then during my undergrad, I started working with a really early stage computational biology startup called Elucidata. Was like the third employee there, and we were doing a lot of large scale data agglomeration for pharmaceutical companies. I guess my interest in comp bio in some ways came from like cancer biology. I had like a lot of, well, extended family members and my grandparents who sort of suffered through cancer. And that kind of sort of drove me into studying cancer a bit and kind of sort of being in the computational biology space. But then after Elucidata, when I came to Yale to do my PhD, I was thinking that I'd continue doing sort of some of this cancer biology work, building sort of therapeutic targets. But it was kind of a chance encounter with my first mentor, Dr. Morgan Levine. They were offering free food for a lecture. So in grad school, it is like if you attend a lecture, you get free food. And so I was friend tempted me with the free food, and I decided to attend her lecture. But that lecture quite changed my perspective on sort of biology in some ways. What she said, which still kind of profoundly has stuck by me, that if you want to solve cardiovascular disease, cancer, or any other aging-related disease, why not just target the root cause of it, which is aging? And that kind of stuck by me, and I decided to rotate with her, eventually join her lab, and that kind of put me on the path of sort of discovery of biomarkers of aging.
It's amazing how it's like it's like a certain combination of words like activates some kind of latent capability or desire in us, almost like a spell. I remember it's like a similar encounter. It was really like the first class of genes and genomes taught by Ford Doolittle,
Yep.
who was my undergrad professor at the time, but he's since made waves in deconstructing Darwin's tree of life. He moved into the realm of philosophy, but his big thing was, what he said to me was, I want you to think about genes not for any function other than that they have evolved to transfer information, like, so that they are themselves evolved to be transferred. Now, whether that's vertically or laterally, that's the root. That's the driving force for everything. And I was just like he completely turned the universe on its head, and that's why I did my PhD with him, and he just showed me exactly how deep the rabbit hole goes. And so here you are, you're down in your wonderland, trying to find, I suppose, is it the Holy Grail or the fountain of youth? Sure, we have kind of idols that humanity's chased in that way.
Yeah.
But what's that journey been like from a computation or an engineer to kind of switch into the omics world?
Yeah. I think it's been very coincidental in some ways, right? Like I would say there were sort of these pivotal moments, these interactions that kind of just transformed my perspective on things. I think just like the one with Morgan was a particular interaction. I guess joining a computational biology startup when I was an undergrad, which honestly back home in India, I'm from Delhi, India, that was way back in the early 2010s. That wasn't something that anyone was doing. So this was very sort of, in some ways, very transformative and coincidental again in that sense to join this comp bio startup. So it's been a lot of these one-off human interactions that kind of have brought me to this point, that have really sort of been very pivotal in shaping how I think about science and how I think about sort of biology in this case. And it's interesting because one won't really imagine an electronics engineer doing sort of hardcore biology of aging and studying what will reverse our aging. But in some ways, it's all science, and it's all very similar. And the ground truth is that I believe that a lot of it is driven by mathematics, which is something that an engineer sort of learns quite at the very early stages of their degree and learning. And that can be sort of co-implemented in any scientific field.
Yeah, the universal language. What did Einstein, Einstein would call it the language of God. Yeah. When we spoke before, did you spend any time in the UK at all?
No, I did not.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I've talked to a number of folks in the longevity space and developing these models, and even this paradigm of like looking at aging as a root cause, and that's not exactly, well, it hasn't historically received a warm reception. So what has that journey been like? Because it's quite contrarian, I think, to to common clinical perception.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is, because I think, and I might go on a tangent here almost.
Please.
But I think it goes back to how we view medicine almost. Medicine to us is very, in sort of the Western concept of things, is very reactive in nature. It is, once you get a disease, shall we treat it? And sort of all our biomarkers, all our interventions are based on that. You get cancer and then we treat it, right? And we
Mhm.
detect cancer. or you get cardiovascular disease and then we treat it. It is not proactive. It is not holistic in nature, right? We're not thinking about health from the very start of our birth, right? Maybe other than vaccinations, I don't think there is anything that we do which is really preventative in nature, right? And that to me is kind of the very fulcrum of the problem, right? Aging science in some ways, or longevity science in some ways, sort of almost perturbs the current model of medicine, which goes from being reactive to asking medicine to be proactive, right? To be sort of preventative at the get-go, which is something that we as is defined in the current Western model of medicine, it's not quite the way we have set it up, so to speak, right? And I think that's kind of where there has been a lot of pushback almost, right? Because in some ways, if you start changing the model of medicine itself, you are sort of toppling over a lot of the current system and paradigms that exist, including modern big pharma, right? And so there is a lot of pushback from not just sort of a scientific perspective, but I would almost say from a capitalistic perspective, right? Because it's a lot more, it's a better payout to constantly have someone sick and give them medicine for it, right? For a pharma company, than to prevent them from having that disease altogether, right? Like if a pharma company was to choose between preventing you from having cardiovascular disease, right, versus giving you statins for the next 20 years of your life after you get it at the age of 50, they would prefer the latter because that makes them a lot more money in some ways. And so in some ways, longevity science sort of goes against all of those paradigms that exist right now, not just in the scientific medical field, but also in sort of a capitalistic pharma way, which is why there's a lot of pushback, I would say, in the field.
Mm. Yeah, I had an interesting conversation, back at the early days, the inception of the podcast with Dr. Nathan Price, worked with Lee Hood. You probably know him. He's now at the Buck Institute. I think he does some consulting with Thorne as well as their chief science officer. And they wrote that book, The Age of Scientific Wellness. And, the whole notion of this digital twin is explored in depth there. And, just, one of the things that, I really liked in their approach, I think it echoes the sentiment that you're describing here is this notion that it's proactive, it's preventative, personalized, and participatory. And, that is it's not even diagnostic because it's like pre-diagnostic, right? It's like kind of insight to, kind of edging and nudging away from disease. And how you might do that, each person is different. And so, you might put it in the frame of healthspan, which I'm kind of jumping out of longevity now, and I'm saying, okay, well, let's come back to the root cause of longevity of aging in a second. But there are these other risk morbidities, comorbidities, if you will. And one of the things I was talking to like Nathan about is like, hey, consider the parable of the decathlete, right? So a modern day decathlete, you don't want to try and be the best at every event because it's probably just genetically unlikely that you have all of that capability, and environmentally it's impossible to have a best performance across all 10. Not impossible, improbable. So your best bet is to like focus on your top three, be world class outside of even being a decathlete. Like you could make the final of the 100, let's say, or shot put, like standalone. But if you bring that top three performance to that level to your top three, and then just kind of average out the other seven, is like that's a good strategy to win. Whereas Nathan was like, yeah, that's cool for high performance, but actually it's the other way for health span, and insofar as like, so take like the top 10 killers that the All of Us project has looked at and developed these PRS scores, and so he said what you want to do is you actually want to focus on your weakest link and focus on that one thing until it's not a thing, and then keep going. And so like I've looked at mine and I'm like, oh yeah, like my number one is cardiometabolic risk. And then number two would be, auto inflammatory disease, Alzheimer's, for example. But you start to think about those things, really early, and you can adjust the rudder. And, that's kind of a health span optimization thing. But what you're talking about is different insofar as, again, getting to the root cause. And you've developed these like switch detectors, if you will, like these epigenetic switches. So what's on, what's off, and that is associated with aging. And so then if that's true, if it is the combination of the expression of genes that's accelerating aging, then how do we switch up that combination and slow down that process, maybe even reverse it? And so how did you come to that place? You've developed, this Symphony age. I think it's one of the most popular age model. Is that the one that, and so how did you develop that? How common is its usage now? What's the how are people using this to kind of drive longevity outcomes, I guess? And
Yeah.
and then and there's probably a feedback loop, because that was like the first generation. So how does that become better and then integrated into like multi-omics, right? Like beyond epigenetics, there's your genomics, there's the microbiome, there's proteomics. So I think all these things are going to become more accessible and predictive. So sorry, that's a mouthful of a question, but to distill it down, it's like, how did you do that? Number one. Number two, how many people are using it? What results we're getting? And then number three is like, how does this get better?
Yeah. I guess it's valuable to sort of think about it in the context of things a little bit. So we have had epigenetic clocks, right, of different kinds, but there's been a key limitation. What epigenetic clocks typically do is they quantify the age of your whole body from a single blood draw. All the likes of the pheno age, grim age, the ones that sort of these were built by some of them were built by Morgan Levine, some by Steve Horvath. They're really powerful clocks, and they're really predictive as well. But to a physician, that might not be super helpful. You see, if you think about it, you have this whole body age and you get a test and you come out with 5 years older. But what will a physician really do about the fact that you're 5 years older? A physician thinks about sort of body in the way of systems, right?
Mhm.
Even our sort of current medicine is divided into sort of the system specific departments, if you'd like to say, right? You have a cardiothoracic department, you have a neurology department, so on and so forth, right? And that's kind of where sort of this idea of the system specific clocks really came through, right? Because if you have to make it interpretable for a physician, right, so that they can act upon it, that's where you need kind of these system specific scores. And so what we really did in some ways was model, for example, cardiovascular age or pulmonary age or neurological age, and sort of predicted that using DNA methylation. Now, the way we modeled it was really interesting. We used these large cohort studies, which had a lot of data from a lot of individuals, their clinical chemistry biomarkers, their functional biomarkers, their proteomics, and a bunch of other things. And so what you could do is really start to see how does aging or how does an aging heart, right, or biomarkers related to an aging heart affect mortality. And you
Mhm.
can build each of these models for each of these different organs or systems, so to speak, right? We built
Mhm.
11 of them because in some ways we were limited by the data that we had, and we could predict those sort of aging trajectories, so to speak, using DNA methylation from the whole blood quite accurately. Now, this is really exciting at some level because what this allows you to do is two things. One is now, of course, a physician will find this a lot more insightful. So, for example, your whole body age might come out to be like you're 5 years older. And now a physician can know why that aging is 5 years older because someone's cardiovascular age is 11 years older than it's supposed to be. But their liver age is 5 years younger. So they don't need to sort of worry about their liver age anymore. What's more critical is to worry about sort of their cardiovascular age. And so now they can give interventions as well, specifically that target the cardiovascular age. And the second thing that becomes really critical is clinical trials. That's where this becomes really exciting. Because right now, a lot of the interventions that we are building in the aging space, they don't sort of act on the whole body. You don't have like a single sort of drug target that will suddenly slow down aging in your whole body. They specifically target different systems. They might target sort of cardiovascular age or your brain age or something like that, right? And so the effect on these whole body aging biomarkers might actually be quite negligible altogether. So, for example, what might happen is you have a therapeutic that might slow down your metabolic age or your cardiovascular age, but the total effect on the whole body age might be really, really small. And so you might not even detect that in a clinical trial setting, right? But you will detect the really large change that would happen at the cardiovascular age level or the metabolic age level. And that's a lot more meaningful and potentially will decrease the number of participants you need in your clinical trial to get a significant change between the drug and the control setting. So that's why it's really sort of translatable both to a clinic and clinical trials. And now at this point, with it being sort of licensed out to True Diagnostic, it's been used by close to 1 million people and been used in a lot of different clinical trials. Rather, right now, most recently, it was used in a clinical trial for semaglutide and Ozempic to show Ozempic essentially slows down aging in different sort of organs of your bodies very targetedly, cardiovascular, metabolic, brain, so on and so forth. And that to me is really powerful in my opinion, right? Because now you can really see which therapeutic is targeting which organ system and even sort of make interventions when a physician is providing them in a very targeted manner. So you're not giving like a medicine which you don't quite know how will decrease age in a particular system, but now you can say like, oh, this person has an increased cardiovascular age, let me give them this medication which will decrease their cardiovascular age because I know that information.
So is this from your like transient framework? Is this like part of the 51 human interventions that you're and probably more coming, I would suspect.
Right. So
Mhm.
one of the things that Translate essentially does is evaluate sort of which biomarkers might be most relevant for which intervention. And right now we published around 51, but now we have close to 100 different longevity focused or potential longevity interventions. And these vary from lifestyle to pharmacological to supplements to even medical procedures. And the focus is how do we really quantify what intervention works for whom?
Right. So that's interesting. I mean, I hate to go back to like the very sophisticated car dashboard analogy because I don't think we're machines, but let's just see how far we can get with it. And I've talked about this before where you have the Model T Ford that probably had no dashboard. You probably didn't even have a gas gauge. And then you've got, the Tesla that gets, up to the minute updates, upgrades,
Yeah.
software upgrades from satellite, new ways of looking and sensing. And so it's not just a detection or a diagnostic. It's also, well, here's the intervention. At the simplest level is like, hey, your gas is low, go fill
Yeah.
up. Your oil change is low, but now it's like, oh, you've driven this far. Now you need your standard inspection. Oh, the balance is off. Go and check the back axle. And so it is kind of like that. Take it into the shop
Yeah.
before you have to take it into demolition repair center because you blew out the wheels and got into a crash.
Yeah.
Um, and so, by analogy, we've got different ways, these 11 clocks and now these 100 plus or so interventions that, correlate with those things. And so here's what I was thinking that maybe you could help me see if I'm thinking about this properly because, and I'll do it by analogy. So when I was a kid, I was going to be a professional baseball player, right? So, or so I thought. It turned out I had like a spondylolisthesis, was having the greatest day of my career. And yeah, back-to-back triples, running for extra bases. They were playing me to pull in right field, so I went the other way into right field for a base hit, and then boom, my back locked up, and I was like instantly like paralyzed. I got thrown out from the outfield, and I remember going and having the conversation with the physiotherapist and getting not even getting the root cause of it because it took me years to get to the proper diagnosis, there was a genetic predisposition for this anatomical protrusion in my spine that
Wow.
could have been avoided or corrected, and later thankfully was. But one of the things that the physiotherapist said to me was, look, if you play sports, you're more likely going to get injured. And, the flip side of that is if you do nothing, you're going to decay. And so sticking into the sport analogy, it's like, if I am like an extreme athlete and I work out too much, it's like more instance and more encounters with wear and tear that, by analogy, I'm saying, so, well, that's what looks like age. Is that what we're saying, is that like age is time independent, but there's obviously a genetic predisposition. There's like an environment where you happen to be and have exposure, for example, and the things you're doing are exacerbating these micromolecular injuries, and that suddenly manifests as age. Is it time to stop thinking about this as time dependent and in fact instance dependent? So again, that's kind of the paradigm I'm trying to sort out in my mind. But you're at the forefront of this.
Yeah. So I think there are two concepts here which I personally really like, right? So there is the concept of hormetic stress, right? So hormetic stress, by the definition of it, is good stress, right? Any kind of physical or even mental, for that matter, stress that is good for you, right? So in some ways, right, one can argue certain types of stressors are good, right? Certain type of damage is good because then you repair and you become healthier. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, kind of, right? So for example, right, a very good example of hormetic stress is calorie restriction, right? What you're doing is you're essentially putting your body in stress, right? You're saying that I'm not going to give you enough food for a little bit of while, right? Or I'm going to give you less food, right? So your body learns to be like, oh, I'm not in a surplus state. I need to do best with what I have, right? But if the other side of calorie restriction is that if you don't eat food at all, you might get malnourished, right? And that would lead to a lot of other havocs, right? So there's this kind of like sort of golden mean of sorts, right? When you provide any kind of stress, which I think about it in the context of athletes or exercise. Exercise in some ways is a form of stress on your body, right? You're making it do stuff which inherently it's not necessarily wanting to do, right? And you're putting some pressure on yourself. But if you make it too much, right, it becomes harsh on it. And that's where kind of the second idea comes in my opinion, right? So when severe damage happens of any kind, how quickly do you bounce back from it, right? And that is the idea of resilience, right? So on one end, you're giving small amounts of stress, which are good, but then sometimes you might give your body too much stress and it might break down, right? Uh, and how quickly do you recover from it is very critical, right? And that is sort of your resilience of your body. And this is an important concept in my opinion, because resilience is what defines how good your body is functioning, right? So you might have a really well functioning body, but if it's not resilient to stress, right? If it's not able to recover back from some kind of physical stress, right? Or it it is a really bad thing because your systems aren't repairing quickly enough for your body to fight better, right? So that's kind of where I think about sort of where these individual sort of afflictions and their sort of downturn and coming back to it structures in, right? So yes, you progressively become worse with age, your resilience goes down. All of those things are important. But it's also important to train your resilience, right? To make yourself more resilient to sort of things that are around you. In some ways, that is where hormetic stress is really helpful. So think about vaccinations, right? Why vaccinations are good? Because it's a form of hormetic stress on your body to become more resilient to a particular pathogen, right? And in the same way, exercise or the likes of those, right, are really important, because what you're doing is you're putting some form of hormetic stress on your body, that when a really bad thing happens, like when a physical injury happens, my body is resilient to recover from it. Of course, this resilience, as I said, goes down with age, right? Because your body is not able to recover as fast, and that eventually becomes one's downfall. That and you reach a point where you go into the stressful state, and then you're quite not able to get back, and that's when sort of you essentially move towards mortality.
Yeah. So that was a good distinction to bring in the hormetic stress, because what I was talking about was more, you go out and you play sport and there could be an impact or an acute injury that has nothing to do with the strategic stress that you just described, right? But so you're exactly right when you talk about, I love track and field as the model, because it's very objective in the measure. It's mostly an individual sport, and you're looking at measuring like higher, faster, longer, right? And you've done a lot of work with an organization called Altis. Actually, their CEO Stu was on the Huberman podcast recently, actually talking about probably hormetics of skipping, and resist the temptation to sprint if you haven't sprinted before, because even the best sprinters, they start to get those injuries cropping up in their mid 20s, late 20s, definitely 30s. But so yeah, and this whole notion of like a strategic stress, and like the performance physiologists done a lot of work here and developed things like the acute to chronic training load ratio, which is really just simply like looking at a Likert scale of rate of perceived exertion. How hard did I train today versus the 7-day sliding window? And I think it's some ratio of something like, if you start to get higher than 1.3, that's where your likelihood of increase of injury, the likelihood of injury increases substantially. So you want to be flirting between like zero.9 and 1.2, because you want to be challenging the system to grow. But then there's also the layer of like, well, what kind of sport? Because if you just do one sport like marathon or powerlifting, exactly, so you lose that versatility. And then if you get hit from another angle, so that's something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of like, say, my own fitness plan is well, what's the versatility of it? Because my goal is no longer, I don't want to go to the Olympics. I don't want to compete. I think you've actually given me a really good way to frame why I do what I do, and what I can now say to my neighbors when they see me doing like crazy, like track drills there, or because I've got to participate in many different sports like boxing and track and field and swimming. And the thing that I really took away from those different disciplines was how to activate and potentiate the body for the activity itself. In that time under the highest stress that your body can handle, if you were to stretch out an entire year of how much do you actually do that, if I was to like add up all the time, it's maybe like 5 minutes, right? But you spend, like thousands of hours just getting ready to do that. And so folks talk about this as like a readiness, like a readiness state, or actually Dr. Kelly Starrett, his company is called The Ready State. And his big claim to fame is he was a doctor of athletic therapy and one of the first CrossFit gym owners. And like, to the best of my assumptions here, he in his mind, it's probably like, gosh, I can't own a CrossFit gym where all these people are getting injured and be a doctor of athletic therapy and not do something about this to prevent the injuries, because that sport is like, yes, there's a versatility there, but there's a lot of pressure and time under tension, and at least in the early days, it was like very, very high intensity. And you'd get a certain type of individual that wants to push to the end, and then boom, the injury happens. So Kelly actually developed all these modality self-therapy, like foam rolling and band traction to reset the tissue after you work out. So sorry, this is all a long way of talking around what we see at the macro level of how do you train resilience in, so that you get into a car accident or you get the flu, or again, some kind of acute emergency happens, you can bounce back from that. Because if you are in bed for a week, you can see the muscle mass decline drastically. And so I guess, like, right, coming back to what's the point of all this is that what we're talking about then is really, if resilience is inversely correlated with age, is there a way to, like, so knowing that, start to think about at a personal level, what are some ways that you can build the hormetic stresses into your life, like that
Right.
actually makes sense, like saunas and fasting and the right kind of exercise, because a lot of things that you see nowadays, like, oh, go do Wim Hof breathing and go to the cold tub, and so like so have you I mean, to the extent that you want to share, is like, what's your protocol? Or,
Yeah.
is there a you said golden mean or golden middle or something like that? Is there like a heuristic that you're starting to see emerge? And just to be clear, I'm not looking for a quick fix or trying to get you to say, you know, hey, what's your top three? And then have everybody running and doing that. But are there some first principles that you're seeing starting to emerge from this that people can start to think about?
Yeah. I think like I think in some ways we're still very sort of structural on what we already know, and it's eat well, sleep well, exercise, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
I think those are some of the most critical things one can do, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and and again, you can go deeper into each of those, right? Thinking about like what do you eat and how do you sleep better and how do you exercise better, right? And then there are different things that work for different people, different biologies have respond differently to different things here. But I think for me, one aspect that I would probably add to this is social connections, right?
Hmm.
Which a lot of people don't talk about that often. I feel like loneliness in itself is a huge epidemic, right? And it's been shown that loneliness is one of the key killers when it comes to mortality, key reasons of mortality. So social connections are super important. I think a lot of the eat well, sleep well, and exercise kind of caters more to like the physical form, but I think sort of social connections are really critical to catering to sort of the mental health of an individual, right? Which is equally critical, in my opinion, if you're thinking about a long, healthy life. And sort of going back to sort of these hormetic stresses and like how do I personally implement some of these, like I think the usual, I would say, I do intermittent fasting on a daily basis. I sort of try to do different types of exercises on a weekly basis, go for a swim, go for a jog, go for a I don't know, go play basketball, something that I enjoy personally. Or even for that matter, I would even argue sort of doing some of those Wii. Have you played some of those Wii games, right?
Hmm.
Which you
Hmm.
can play at your home. I think that's a form of exercise if you were
Hmm.
doing it quite structurally in a form that is this thing. You can again, whatever works for you, right, is important in some ways, right? The cardiovascular sort of association suggests at least or says at least 150 minutes of exercise every week. Now that's very less. That's what 30 minutes of exercise every day, and that is anything that you can do. Like even go for a walk, right?
Hmm.
That to me in a way is exercise if you can't do a lot, and that will go a long way, right? Just like doing the bare minimum is also critical. Most people around us, I would argue, don't even do the bare minimum, which is why there's like 40% obesity in the United States, right? And I think that is, in my opinion, like the lowest hanging fruits one could do to make themselves healthy.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned something I think really important that I wasn't thinking about, and again, you said the social component of it, and can you integrate the social component into the physical component so that it's more like play, right?
Yeah.
And and then that does something else too, and I think that's another thing that you made me think about, is like, well, then there's the meaning component, right? Like we've seen this phenomenon all the time, is people retire, they have nothing to do, and there's the psychological component, the drive, willingness to live without meaning is greatly diminished. So
Yeah.
um have you seen anything like that in the studies that you're doing, like epigenetic profiles associated with a decreased motivation or decreased meaning? Is there a gene expression for our search for meaning?
I guess like one way to look at this is depression, right? Depression
Mm.
is
Mhm.
when people start to lose meaning in what they're
Mm.
doing, and sort of prevents them from sort of being functional in some ways, right? Uh,
Mm,
and it is like there have been in a lot of studies that have shown that people with depression have accelerated epigenetic age. Now, there
mm,
could be multiple different confounders, right? Like it could
mm,
be, they're not sort of being as functional, which is leading to an increased epigenetic age. But there seems to be clear signatures of depression, anxiety, even like disorders like bipolar disorder embedded in our epigenetics, which can really sort of go back to the point that if your mental health is in a perturbed state, right? It's not making you feel meaningful, or life is not feeling meaningful in some ways, or you're stressed in maybe
mhm,
on the hermetic zones of mental health. Uh, it is bad for you, right?
mhm,
It leads to bad sort of aging, so to speak, or
mm,
accelerated aging. So there is a lot of precedence in that context, and in some really large cohort studies around sort of MDD and associations with epigenetic age, after even sort of taking out all confounding factors like exercise and obesity and the likes of those, still found very strong associations between these two groups.
mm. So it's interesting because we started talking at the top of the call about, reactive nature medicine, and now we've had like insights around the epigenetic signatures associated with some of these conditions.
Yeah,
And so, I guess this is like a two-part question. There's maybe three. Well, the first part is a statement is like, okay, it seems there's a clinical utility of these things to better inform and create better predictive models so that we can make more precision preventative therapies, let's say. So that's my statement. And then I guess the two-part question is, besides the clinical research side of things, is who are the early adopters? Who are these people using this today? Because I think those are the ones like on the consumer side are like, oh, okay, how do I use this to increase my chronological to biological age ratio, let's say? And so they're call them biohackers.
yeah,
But then I guess the second part of that question is, do you imagine a future where this is like, I gave you the car dashboard analogy where it's like, okay, well, your epigenetic scan becomes part of your routine checkup. And, right now it's, from a blood draw, let's say, but who knows in the future, it might even be, different metrics that were used, we can use to scan to
yeah,
infer the
yeah,
state of methylation, right? Right. So I mean, there's that ultra super future Star Trek version of the like instant scan, but like there's the space of like the reality and the gap in between that, which is like, okay, when does this become a part of a standard proactive well care program? Which
yeah,
to me sounds like it's a whole new channel or segment outside of healthcare. So
yeah.
I don't know if any of that made sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So I guess going to your last question first, right? Where are we right now with these tests, and how are they being implemented? Right now, a lot of these tests, right, are getting implemented into healthcare, but in a certain section of healthcare, I would say, right? So it's what we call as sort of these longevity clinics, right? That's where sort of where a lot of these epigenetic panels and epigenetic biomarkers and other sort of readouts like proteomic biomarkers that can predict aging and the risk of different occurrence of different diseases, right? The risk profile biomarkers, they're being implemented quite heavily in the longevity clinic space. And by virtue of that, of course, you have biohackers who are also trying some of these things out and getting some really exciting results and sort of improvements in their health. But of course, it'll take a decent amount of validation, right? Because right now these tests have been validated on what 100,000 individuals or the likes of those, or maybe a million, right? But I would say like it would require a lot more validation into sort of their predictive powers and their risk powers to be implemented in like a day-to-day healthcare setting, right? Where you go to your physician and you get these tests done, right? Like the regular blood biomarker draw at Quest Diagnostics. Um, and part of the problem, as I said here, is the change to a preventative healthcare model, right? For example, Medicare right now does have some preventative systems, like you are need to do like I think like you're allowed to do like one cholesterol test or one sort of the likes of those every 4 years or something after the age of 40. But that's too less, too little, too
Mm-hmm.
late, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like once you're 40, you're really hurtling towards cardiovascular disease. And most people, and once every 4 years is barely anything, right? Like this
Mm-hmm.
is something that should be done every year, maybe every 6 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and probably starting at the age of 25, I would say that's where your sort of systems start declining, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it's too little, too late in some ways. So getting that shift almost will take, like, first agreeing that you have to move beyond clinical biomarkers, and then second, you have to sort of get it done at a younger age and get that approved by Medicare or Medicaid would take forever, in my opinion, right? And that's, for example, at least in the US healthcare system, and doing it across the globe would take even longer. So
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of barriers, I would say, from a implementation and sort of policy perspective, uh, but not so much from like the science perspective, because the science is progressing on. We're building better biomarkers, new iterations of it every day, and they are being used by people who can sort of pay for them
Mm-hmm.
out of pocket. So it's not like
Yeah.
we're not getting them implemented in clinic. It's just to implement them en masse will just take a lot longer and a lot more policy and legal changes.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, you can imagine like a very practical use case now where, you're in the context of like performance longevity. So like astronauts, for example, who do multiple missions. So like, okay, you sign up, you're in, you're doing like right in the day that you're, so say accepted and certified, it's like we have your age clock, and then we're monitoring you kind of pre and post stress, right? Because we're saying these are the stresses that you're exposed to, and again, we're looking at your resilience over time is like, and then it's like it's not so much an age score as it is like, hey, based on where your epigenetic set point is at this moment versus where it started, unless we make these changes, you've got two more missions and you're done.
Yeah.
And so the goal might be like, well, but I want 10 more missions. I don't know if those numbers make sense. I'm not close to astronaut performance programs at the moment, but you can think about it in professional sport too, right? You can think about this as like a service that, the agents are supplying to the athletes. It's like, hey, this was a particularly hard season for you. This is what we got to think about if we want to like, nurture or steward the career and not the contract. So I think you can see some immediate applications on like the performance longevity side of things. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I suspect there's some of that going on in the industry.
Yeah. No, there are a lot of companies sort of attempting to do that, slash already
Mm-hmm.
doing that in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, shape. And I would almost say, like, I don't know if you came across sort of, well, I wouldn't say these are performance longevity, but I would say it's a way to make longevity more of a sport almost. Have you come across sort of longevity Olympics or Olympics? This is something that Brian Johnson started. Uh,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Literally like compete for how good your aging scores are,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So yeah, gamification of longevity. Yeah.
it's gamification, but more importantly, I feel like it's almost like a proxy of saying how healthy you are and how whether it's sort of in some ways you can sort of segment people into like, oh, these are sports folks and these are sort of just regular biohackers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and then sort of do a lot of different things there. But the point is, yes, in a lot of ways, there is this whole idea of using sort of these biomarkers just for sort of healthy people who are using it for the purposes of improved performance, right? Whether it's
Right.
athletic, something or
Right. Well, you put you pointed to something there is like, motivated populations or motivated communities. I mean, you can even imagine like life insurance. It's like, like let's assume that we all want to do good, right?
yeah,
And this isn't going to be misused. I know that's a big assumption, but let's go for it. Let's start with the highest possible good outcome here. And so I've got life insurance, and so it's actually the person buying life insurance, like if I buy life, I don't want to collect it. Honestly, I want it there in case my family needs it. And the life insurance company, obviously, they want to minimize the amount of claims that they need to pay out. So it seems to me like a good kind of
Mix.
shared goal is like, everybody who comes in to whatever life insurance company, we are going to work with you to maximize your chronological to biological age ratio.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I've spoken to a few folks in the industry who have thought about that. I guess the question is, are people ready for that? Can it be communicated in a way, like, can we learn from the DNA side of things in 23andMe, for example? And, like, can we communicate this in a way where it's actionable? And I think, again, to bring it full circle is like, hey, if we've got, well, I thought 51, you're saying more than 100 potential interventions. It's like, hey, here is an itemized and prioritized list of the things, hey, that we all should be doing anyway, but this is the order that you ought to pursue them, because here are the gains that you can see in 6 months if you do them. And then that's like, and then here's how way to gamify it, and you won't be held against you. So, again, that's a very hopeful future that I'm describing, but that's just one thing that you've got me to think about in this conversation.
no, for sure. And I think that could be
Mhm.
really exciting in some ways, right? Almost gamifying life insurance itself. But
Yeah,
yeah, and there have been attempts to do that, but it's been a challenging field in some ways. Again,
sure.
it's pushing the paradigms for how life insurance and the likes of those are measured, and it's always challenging to do that.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, as I mentioned at the start, I was going to ask you my favorite three questions at the end, because it's usually easier to answer. One of the things I love about these conversations, I never quite know exactly what I'm going to learn. And so, if I think back through our conversation, I'd love to know what you think in terms of, like, what's the key takeaway here that we should convey to folks listening, recognizing that we have a mixed audience. We have, well, probably some biohackers, we have some entrepreneurs, we have scientists, we have investors. Yeah. So what's the key, thing that we might say to them, and, who needs to hear this most of all? And then number three is your recommendation on the next guest. Who should my next guest be? Yeah.
Sure. I guess the key takeaway, in my opinion, is that aging is not unified. It's not a single metric, right?
Hmm.
It's quantified under a single metric. And if we need to treat aging or even sort of slow it down, so to speak, right, we need to have it broken down into its components, right, in some ways, and components that the current systems can understand. In this case, modern medicine understands it in the form of like organs and systems, right? And if we need to treat aging or even build treatments for aging, right, the only way to do that right now in the current system is to break it down into what people and physicians understand. And that's kind of what hopefully sort of aging science will move towards, breaking down aging into simplified components that people understand with ease. I guess to your second question, who is the one person who I kind of most hope this conversation reaches out to? I guess there are two people I would really be excited this conversation reaches out to. One is physicians, and especially physicians who might be potentially policymakers, right? Uh,
Mm.
on seeing and understanding why we need to change the paradigm of medicine, right? From being reactive to proactive, and how do we go about doing that so that it benefits not just a limited few, but the general population. And I guess the second one probably is more personal. I would like this conversation to probably reach a scientist in a third world country, sort of, and be inspired by it, because
Mm.
in some ways, my journey has been that of a lot of evolution from limited means. And I hope this sort of inspires somebody to pursue aging science and have more people in sort of the longevity field, probably not just within the bounds of sort of the Western context, but potentially beyond the Western context as well.
Mm.
And I guess who would I nominate? Probably Steve Horvath, who's like the father of DNA methylation aging clocks. I think they would be someone who can really speak to the value of these epigenetic clocks to quite an extent, even better than I can. So having them on here would be amazing.
Amazing. Well, I'll work to track them down, and, thank
Yeah.
you so much, Dr. Sehgal. This has been, eye-opening for me. you've given me a few things to integrate into, my own daily operating system around the theme of, well, resilience through versatility with the strategic implementation of these like hormetics, as you called them. So yeah, I'm going to do some thinking about how to translate that into kind of a toolkit that maybe some of our listeners could understand, at least from a first principles point of view. But really excited to continue, following to continue to follow your innovation and your creation. And thank you so much for everything that you've done and will do for the field.
Thank you. And thanks for having me, Jeremy. It was really fun.
The thread is real. Your body is an orchestra, not a metronome. And Dr. Sehgal, well, he shows us that prevention is not a luxury, but a calling, if you will, to tune each system, to build resilience, and to play in harmony. The question is no longer whether aging can be measured, but whether we will dare to act before the music falters. As you leave this episode, ask yourself, what instrument in your life needs a little bit of tuning? And, who will benefit if you play it well? Finally, how might your own rhythm join into a larger symphony of health, community, and flourishing? Well, so the invitation is simple yet profound to follow this hidden thread and to become more than the sum of your years.